Well, I want to welcome everyone to the story of Unitarian Universalism. I'm glad to see that we didn't lose too many people after the meal. I had my eye out for those who swooped in for these burritos and then made their way out, but I'm glad to see that many of you stayed for the main attraction, so to speak. My plan tonight is threefold. I have worked diligently to try and put an extremely rich history into about an hour, which is nearly an impossible feat, and I'm sure I am doing an injustice to many people in many places. But I wanted to provide a rough framework, a skeleton of sorts. There won't be a ton of meat on these bones, but hopefully it will give you a sense of how we got to where we are today. And then I will also share my perspective on how I understand Unitarian Universalism, how I think it's practiced today. And I will also hopefully leave room for ample questions at the end. So I want to let all of you know that if there are things that come up, and if you have questions, that there will be an opportunity to ask those as well. Of course, one of the most challenging parts of telling any story is the question of where to begin, because any story can last for a variety of durations and can tell many different truths from many different perspectives. And so my hope tonight is to tell a story that is relatively brief and relatively true. And if I can do both of those, I will be satisfied. I think a good starting point for the story of Unitarianism and Universalism is in early Christianity. Something that is often lost is that the theological commitments that we are heir to are not really new ideas, contrary to what you may hear. From the very beginnings of the Jesus movement, there were groups of people who were thinking in similar ways to the way we are thinking today, and that our ancestors have thought. And so I wanted to lift up two folks in particular, two early church fathers. Firstly, Arius of Alexandria, who was in some ways the earliest church father of a non-Trinitarianism. So this was at a time after Constantine had institutionalized and politicized Christianity, when the Christian church was trying to figure out what the dominant theology would be. What do we really make of this Jesus figure? What do we make of the Father? And what do we make of the Holy Spirit? And as you probably know, it was in fact Athanasius who prevailed at the First Council of Nicaea, which is the reason that the Father and the Son, and then later the Spirit, were declared all one essence, one substance. They were all one. But up until that point, it was relatively controversial, and it was up for debate what the relationship was between Jesus and God. And Arius was someone who argued that Jesus falls somewhere in between the Father and humanity. And this was a very heretical perspective at that time. That brand of non-Trinitarianism did not die out, even though it was in some ways a minority perspective at the First Council of Nicaea. It in fact persisted through Europe and Northern Africa for a variety of centuries, and then eventually kind of drizzled out in the 7th century. The second figure that is important is Origen, and he perhaps is somewhat more familiar, certainly better known, and was really heralded within Universalist circles because he advocated what was known as apokatastasis. That's a mouthful, but more or less this idea was that somewhere down the road, all things would be restored to God. There was no eternal punishment, according to this view, because the fire of punishment was not an instrument of eternal torment, according to Origen, but rather one of divine instruction. So there was a good chance you would suffer for a while. You would probably burn for a while. But because God was teaching you through that suffering, and because the soul was rational and would respond to God's teachings, then as a result, eventually you would be convinced of God's truth and you would eventually be saved and reunited with God. He was, of course, charged with heresy and condemned right up until his death, which is the story of many of our ancestors. The way I want to tell this story, that's just a brief background. We're going to now do a leap to the kind of more modern times, modern being the 16th century. But the way I put this together, there are many ways to tell this story. There's an institutional story. I could tell you about all the associations and organizations and denominations that formed, and that would probably be even more boring than what you're going to get tonight. I could also point out specific people. This is often how the history is told, and I've tried to do some of that. But as you will notice, there are often quite a few people who are left out, and it really fails to take into account the fact that our theology, our faith was lived as much in these great pioneers as it was on the ground. There were a lot of people who went unnoticed. So I have decided to split up our history into 9 specific chapters that are kind of themes. And what I want you to do as you're listening to these themes is to have 2 things in mind. Firstly, I want you to hear in these themes resonances with our faith today, because I'm trying to prove the point through all of this that where we are today is in some ways a natural and organic development of where we have come from. The second thing I want you to pay attention to is the sheer variety of opinions. I think it is often held, certainly within Christian circles and even within Unitarian Universalist circles, that there was kind of one dominant opinion. That is very much not the case. There has always been controversy. You have probably heard the adage, where there are 2 Unitarians, there are 3 opinions. And that has certainly been the case in our history as well. So I'm going to launch right in to the first stage, and that is one of tolerance. I want to point your attention to Transylvania, which is kind of on the eastern tip of what was the Kingdom of Hungary. It's now a part of Romania. And in 1543, Transylvania declared independence. And in 1561, the Diet recognized King John Sigismund, the first and the only, unfortunately, king in history who was Unitarian. So what does a Unitarian king look like? Well, here's what he did. For one, he was deeply interested in religion. But he was not only interested in religion, he wanted to pacify religion. He wanted to make sure that the conflicts between Roman Catholics and Greek Orthodox and Lutherans and Calvinists and Unitarians was in some way tolerable. So what he did is he advocated a policy of open discussion and broad toleration. Sounds a lot like Unitarian Universalism today. And in fact, according to historians, Transylvania at that time was the freest country in Europe in religious matters. This is the legacy of a Unitarian king. He issued the Act of Religious Tolerance and Freedom of Conscience in 1568, which read in part, and I quote, "In every place the preacher shall preach and explain the gospel, each according to his understanding of it." Now, Sigismund also appointed Francis David as his court preacher in 1566, and David was one of the only Unitarian court preachers that we have known. True to his Unitarian as opposed to his Trinitarian leanings, he thought that this Nicene description of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit amounted to little more than human intervention and superstition. And so he advocated passionately for the Unitarian perspective. And yet he was also very tolerant. These were debates that were in some ways analogous to the sports that we watch today. That, you know, if you wanted to get together and watch a good show, you came to listen to these court preachers duke it out. And he had a reputation for being very, very convincing. As a result, Unitarianism reached its institutional peak in Transylvania in 1571, and there were approximately 500 Unitarian congregations. So Unitarianism was flourishing all the way over in Eastern Europe. That was until King Sigismund died and was replaced by a Calvinist king. And as a result, Francis David was jailed, and he eventually died in prison as a religious martyr. The next stage is that of reason. And I am going to lift up two individuals who began the act of applying reason to the Scriptures. The first one was Joseph Priestley. He arrived in Pennsylvania in 1796, where he crystallized the first official Unitarian movement in the United States. He's seen in some respects as the father of American Unitarianism. It's interesting, though, because he was not a theologian. He was, in fact, a scientist, the first man to discover oxygen. But he was driven by his native England when a mob that was aroused by the Church of England came in, burnt down his home, destroyed his laboratories, tried to steal all of his library books and do away with them. And then went on to ravage all of the Unitarian churches in Birmingham, a real nice crew. Well, as a result, Priestley fled to the United States, and he wrote in a theological pamphlet, and I quote, "To say as Trinitarians do that the three divine persons of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost are only one God is as much a contradiction as to say that three men, though they differ from one another as much as any three men do, are not three men but are one man." And so you can already see that he was beginning to use the faculty of reason to try and interpret and make sense of the logic of this Trinitarian scheme. The other man that's worthy of noting is John Murray, who was in some ways the father of the Universalist movement. And he was Methodist, also from England, and he was a stark Calvinist. In other words, he believed in original sin. He also believed that you were predestined. In other words, that you were either going to go to heaven or to hell. There was not really much you could do about it, and you weren't going to know in this lifetime either. And that was his school of thought as a Calvinist Methodist. But he had a member in his parish who followed the teachings of James Resly. And this really gave him, this woman actually gave him a lot of problems because she vehemently disagreed with this position. So they would get in these disputes. And eventually, she convinced Murray that she was right and that he was wrong. She convinced him that all generations sinned against God with Adam and were redeemed by God with Jesus Christ. What that meant was that salvation was not something in the future, but something that had already happened. Through the mystical union of the believer with Jesus Christ, that you were already saved because Jesus had effectively guaranteed that salvation. Now, I understand at this point you may be saying, enough of this theological minutia, and that's a fair place to be. But I want you to try and put yourself in the shoes of people for whom this was really life or death. These things really mattered. And for him to say that all people who believed in Jesus were saved was an extremely radical thought at the time. He, of course, based his argument on Scripture, and this is something that we Unitarian Universalists often like to forget. Our early forefathers and foresisters were adamant biblical literalists. They were proving their position based on their reading of the Scriptures literally. And so, someone like John Murray would lift up Timothy 4:10, God is the Savior of all people, especially those who believe. Especially those who believe, but really all people. Similarly, 1 Corinthians 15:22, for as in Adam all die, even so in Christ all shall be made alive. So he was basically proof texting. He was picking out different scriptural excerpts and saying, see, I want to prove my point. It's an interesting story too, and I unfortunately won't have a lot of time to go into it, but when John Murray was sailing over in his ship, which was called the Hand in Hand, he initially wanted to go to New York, but he washed ashore on the Jersey coast. And it was not quite Jersey Shore that he encountered when he got there, but instead he encountered Thomas Potter, who also had certain expectations of him, wanted him to preach. And he said, and John Murray was really reluctant to preach, but he said, all right, fine, I will preach if the conditions do not improve and if I'm here tomorrow morning. And much like New England with our snow days, the conditions didn't improve much. And so he was there the following day and he eventually preached. Well, he all of a sudden realized, hey, I'm pretty good at this. People are receptive to my message, and ended up being an itinerant preacher up and down the East Coast, eventually settling in Gloucester, Mass. to create the first Universalist congregation known as the Independent Church of Christ, which he established in 1780. The next part of this, so we've established a certain toleration of different perspectives. We've also seen the importance of reason and applying reason to the scriptures. Well, increasingly, as our Unitarian and Universalist forebears applied reason to the scriptures, they started to call into question just who this Jesus character really was. I'll start with the Unitarian side of things. Unitarianism was asking about the divinity of Jesus, because this was one of the things that was implied by the Unitarian perspective. If there is only one God, then we're also assuming that Jesus is not that one God. So who is Jesus? What do we do with this figure? Well, there was a man by the name of William Ellery Channing, who was raised in Newport. He was actually the grandson of William Ellery, who was one of the signatories in the Declaration of Independence. He was Harvard trained, this William Ellery Channing, rather small in stature, probably about yay high, but he was known throughout Boston for his ability to preach really good sermons. And he preached, he served actually at Boston's Federal Street Church. He was called there in 1803. And the Federal Street Church is the church that we know today as Arlington Street Church. He preached in 1819 a sermon that crystallized the Unitarian denomination, although it was not yet a denomination, but the Unitarian theology. Up until that point, the term Unitarianism was actually a derogatory term. It was a term used by the Calvinists, who were dismissing these rogue liberal Congregationalists who believed that there was one God and not a Trinity. And what William Ellery Channing did was in some ways reclaim that term and make it mean something. He preached this sermon, and in it he basically made the following arguments. Number one, he argued for human goodness and free will against the Calvinist doctrine of original sin. So it was not that humans were innately sinful, but rather that they were predisposed to a possible good. Secondly, as you might imagine, he argued for the unity of God against Trinitarian conceptions. Thirdly, he argued for the importance of using reason in interpreting scriptures and in living a religious life. And what's of most importance to us is that he understood Jesus as someone who enacted moral and spiritual deliverance, salvation we might say, through his instruction and his own spotless example. So it was not that Jesus was in any way a metaphysical character, the way that many of the early Universalists were understanding that mystical union with Jesus. It was not that per se, but it was rather that the teachings of Jesus, the way that he lived his life, was in some ways a demonstration of what it means to be saved. He argued that we follow God not because God is powerful, but because God is good, and that we want to worship a good God, and we should follow Jesus, who really understood what it meant to worship a good God. Now that stood in some contrast with Universalism at this point in time. Universalism was asking a slightly different question. Again, Universalism had declared that there was universal salvation for all people, but it was trying to figure out what Jesus' role was in that salvation. So the first point here, the Lamb of God perspective, that's the one that in some ways was already mentioned, that Jesus serves as a ransom, redeeming humanity. That was the position espoused by the Calvinist Universalists. So you'll notice here that there were Universalists who held Calvinist beliefs. It gets a bit complicated here. But that was a significant portion, especially early Universalists. And so they believed that in dying and being crucified, Jesus redeemed all of humanity. And it is through that resurrection that we too are saved. Then there was a man by the name of Hosea Ballou, a great name, and he had a slightly different perspective. His perspective was one of Jesus as the prophet of love. He believed that Jesus disclosed divine love, not ancient sin, that God does not need to be reconciled to humanity, but rather that humanity needs to be reconciled to God. So by inverting that, again, Jesus became not a sacrificial lamb, but rather a prophet of a new way of doing religion. Even though Universalists almost unanimously, by about 1815, adopted a Unitarian understanding of the Godhead. So that's an interesting point. So they were holding their ideas of universalist salvation, but by 1815, the Calvinist understanding of the Trinity had kind of died out. And most Universalists at that time were Unitarian in their theology. One would think that that would be an ample time for the Unitarians and the Universalists to become bedfellows, get rather close, join together, increase in numbers. But the Unitarians weren't so thrilled, and there were a couple reasons that the Unitarians were a bit reluctant to get too close to these shabby Universalists. For one, there were significant differences in class. The Universalists tended to attract lower and middle class folk, whereas the Unitarians were the Boston Brahmins. Harvard was run by Unitarians at this point. All of the state government in Massachusetts was Unitarian. You had Unitarians in high positions on the national level. These were Harvard-trained elites. And they didn't think much of these Universalists' uneducated, low socioeconomic classes. Another interesting point is that the Unitarians weren't as thrilled about this whole universal salvation thing. They actually thought that hell was a pretty good thing because it kept you morally disciplined. And so they were a bit reluctant to ascribe to this universal salvation spiel. Now, once we had Jesus more or less figured out, then people started to call into question how we know what we know. And that's where we had a couple individuals that I want to briefly mention. Some of these may already be familiar to you. The first one is a Universalist, Abner Kneeland. Again, a really good 19th century name. And he began to probe the sources of revelation by arguing that God and nature, so far as we can attach any rational idea to either, are synonymous terms. So this was the very beginning of seeing revelation beyond just something that you get in a book. He was a rather interesting fellow. He would read passages from Leviticus concerning menstruation and then hurl the Bible across the room in anger. He was also, though, a radical social vision. He had a radical social vision, and he was a champion of equal rights, interreligious marriage, and abolition in the 1820s. He was eventually jailed for blasphemy in 1838. Now, Unitarianism, up until this point, was advocating what is known as a rational supernaturalism. It's a big word, and here's ultimately what it means. It means that with this whole reason thing, they began to create or develop an understanding of natural religion. That religion is something that comes naturally to us as humans and can be discerned in the moral and natural laws of the universe. But that wasn't quite enough. They needed revealed religion as well to supplement that. So there is a good deal that we can know just by living our lives, by looking at nature, by kind of doing the things that we do. But then there are some things, some miracles, some aspects of authority and revelation that we need in addition. And that is provided to us by the Bible. Emerson wasn't so convinced. Ralph Waldo Emerson, in his 1839 Divinity School address, one of the most defining sermons ever preached in the Unitarian Universalist tradition, attacked miracles outright as a viable form of religious knowledge. Nonsense, he said. He said, the miracle that I know is the rising of the sun and the setting of the sun. Every day, every part of nature and of life is a miracle. I don't need any of this supernaturalism stuff. He also denied the personal authority of Jesus. He said that we should revere Jesus for his principles, but we should not revere Jesus the person. He went on to say that the soul knows no persons. The soul only knows abstract laws. For him, revelation was an intuition of the soul. It was something that you felt internally when you were walking outside in nature. And he felt that that was really the only possible source of religious knowledge. And there was Theodore Parker, who's pictured here. He had mastered ancient languages. He also studied German. And he was well versed in biblical historical criticism that was coming out of Germany at the time. And using all of those tools, he gradually came to follow in Emerson's footsteps by denying Christianity its reliance on miraculous revelation. He argued that Jesus preached an absolute religion, and that, again, his authority derived not from who he was, but by the validity and the compelling nature of the message that he gave. He also, though, deeply loved Jesus and said Jesus was, according to him, the most divinely inspired person in history, but that very inspiration is also available to us now. So you might say that this entire period that was really known as the Transcendentalist period and would lead into pragmatism, one of the most viable American philosophical traditions that was then spread throughout the world. William James is someone that might come to mind. In essence, these transcendentalists turned inward in many ways. And for them, the authority of revelation, the way that we know what we know about religion, is by turning inward into our souls. We don't need to look to books. We don't need to look to miracles. Of course, there was a conservative backlash to this. James Norton, for example, argued that humans should not pretend to attain direct knowledge of the infinite. He said that this is pure hubris, this idea that I, a fallible human being, can know something about the infallible. And Henry Ware Jr. argued that it is impossible to develop a relationship with an abstract concept. And so he really pushed back against Emerson's insistence that souls know people. He said, I don't know how I can form a relationship or live a holy life if I'm not in some ways speaking to or in dialogue with or in relationship with a person. Reform, social reform. This is a thread throughout the Unitarian and Universalist heritage. And it's important to point out that the reason that Unitarians and Universalists primarily engaged in justice making and various forms of what we now call social justice was in large part because they saw it as an extension of their theologies. For Unitarians, again, who were seeing Jesus as a model of the human potential for self-realization and self-fulfillment, this idea that humans are fated to go onward and upward forever, that in light of this, it was absolutely inconceivable that you would deny human beings the possibility, based on institutional injustices, to fulfill themselves. Universalist ideas praised the love of God, the abundant love of God, and said that it is, again, inconceivable that we should build institutions or allow our institutions to rob people of the opportunity to experience that divine love. One of the tensions, though, that existed in social reform, and I think we see some of this today as well, is the tension between individualism and communalism. So there was, on the one hand, especially kind of epitomized by the Emersonian transcendentalists, there was an idea that social change is a very kind of individual effort. And yet there were also, on the other hand, many individuals who believed that social change should happen in communitarian forms of living. And so it's one of the reasons that Unitarians were infamous for their socialist experiments. There was Hopedale, Brook Farm, Northampton, Fruitlands, all of these small independent communities propped up where they experimented with various forms of socialism, seeing that as a natural outgrowth of their theology in human worth and human interdependence. I should also note that Unitarians and Universalists were very involved in the issues of the day in the mid-19th century. Abolition of slavery and then even reintegration. It's interesting, in 1853, Universalists already were expressing concern over our miserable prejudices. and were concerned that, yeah, we might be able to free blacks, but what is going to happen afterward if we don't change the way that we whites perceive of them? So this was a relatively radical thought. Unitarian and Universalists were also very involved in women's rights issues. In fact, Universalists ordained the first woman in 1863 and had the first continental women's organization in the United States. Lastly, education for both Unitarians and Universalists was of utmost importance. And in particular, there was a man by the name of Horace Mann who advocated for non-sectarian education, specifically the public university system that we know today, and was one of the real reasons that we have public education today. The institutions of Tufts University, St. Lawrence University, and Caltech are all originally Universalist universities. Now, this interesting looking fellow came along and really mixed things up for everyone. Darwin, when he published On the Origin of the Species in 1859, really kind of drove a stake in the midst of liberal theology at that time. There was tremendous fear that the type of natural law that he had discovered, you might say, brought with it implications of mechanism. The idea that we are all slaves to this natural law. And there was a fear that in some ways did away with the possibility for gradual growth towards a loving and benevolent force that would help us self-realize ourselves. So it was in a way neutralizing the universe, whereas before Unitarians and Universalists saw a loving and a really benevolent force in the universe itself. Also, his subordination of the individual to the species reduced these eternal moral codes that both Unitarians and Universalists held to a series of evolving human inventions, and this was a real threat. So initially there was total repudiation of Darwin, charges that it amounts to little more than atheism. But then over time, it's funny how these things go, there was gradual acceptance, and lastly, downright embrace and integration. Unitarians came to argue that God works by evolution, that our progress is ongoing, and that we can see God working in our lives as we grow to higher stages of consciousness and higher stages of our moral imagination. And there was actually the growth of something that was known as scientific theism, the idea that nature exhibits its own intelligibility, indicative of a caring, intelligent universe. So again, there was that reinsertion of the caring by using the very principles of evolution. But religion, aside from God, religion also was then mapped on to this Darwinian stage of evolution. And it was believed that religion can also evolve into higher, more advanced, more mature stages. Unitarians were convinced that all religions were true, but that they were progressive and sequential. And so Christianity was kind of the highest form of religion, and you could break that down even further. Their brand of Christianity, of course, was higher than this Roman Catholicism that was steeped in rituals and various other barbaric ideas. But they also applied this rationale as they turned eastward to the Eastern traditions. For example, they saw Hinduism as a form of Eastern Catholicism because of its excessive use of ritual, and they kind of dismissed that as being a more infantile stage of religious development. In contrast, Buddhism, because it had in some ways shed a lot of that ritual, was seen as the Eastern Protestantism, and so that was very acceptable. Buddha, of course, then became a Christ-like figure who named and therefore took on the world's suffering. So it's a very interesting, by the late 19th century, Unitarians in particular were already looking to other world religions, but with a very specific take on what these religions were about. The Unitarian Jenkin Lloyd Jones initiated in 1893 the Parliament of World Religions, the first of its kind, the first formal gathering of representatives of Eastern and Western religious traditions. And in some ways, you might say it was the beginning of interreligious dialogue over a century ago. Now, the next stage in this was humanism, and we're gradually now coming to the 20th century and nearing the end. And humanism then radicalized everything that had been building up until this point. It's important to note that religious humanism, as it was called, was a movement that developed both within and beyond Unitarian and Universalist circles. So there were religious humanists within Unitarianism and Universalism, but it was also in some ways its own separate beast. Curtis Reese, who was one of the early proponents, explained humanism in this way. He argued that theism, the belief in God, is philosophically possible. He did not deny that God did not exist. So it was philosophically possible that God exists, but it was not religiously necessary. It is possible, he argued, to be religious without believing in God or in immortality. Now, this was a radical new idea. As a religious movement, and it's important to note that religious humanism was in some ways saw itself as a balance between two opposing forces at the time, and this is the early 20th century. It represented a compromise between liberal Christianity on the one hand, which it distanced itself from because of the excessive God language, and on the other hand, the utter skepticism of materialism. And it wanted to distance itself from that because it wanted to clear space for the possibility of inspiration, of spirituality. So it really was a religious movement, you might say, compared to materialism, but it was a humanistic movement as compared to liberal Christianity. It was a movement that emphasized human capabilities, especially the human capacity to reason. It adopted the scientific method, and it really praised science as the next frontier of revelation. And it also promoted the right of all humans to develop their full potential. And so you'll notice in that description there is no mention of the word God. And that is because humanists shifted the focus of religion from a God out there to a humanity, right here and right now, and insisted ultimately that we humans have the power within ourselves to make a difference to history. The document that crystallized this movement was issued in 1933, and there were Unitarians and Universalists that both signed this document. It was called the Humanist Manifesto. It's perhaps interesting to note that this manifesto was a theological and a political document. It was theological because it laid out its understanding of humanity's role in religion. But it also was political in that it offered a new philosophy to support a socialist agenda. It was the strong opinion of these religious humanists that only a socialized and cooperative economic order could truly distribute property in a way that would offer each human being the possibility to realize his or her own full potential. As you might imagine, the theists at the time were rather appalled by this suggestion that we can just somehow bracket God out of everything and go about our daily business. And there was one man in particular by the name of Reverend Charles E. Park, who on the one hand praised the humanist movement for its valuable suspicion towards the idolatrous misuse of the term God. But at the same time, Park went on, and I find this rather interesting, to argue that humanism's vision of God was too narrow. He wrote, and I quote, "Theism declares that God is more than God's creation. God is inexhaustible. But humanism claims that God is exhausted in God's creation, that God's being is coterminous with humanity." So it's interesting to note that in some ways the theistic response was saying that you are narrowing yourself too much as opposed to broadening, which is what the religious humanists sought to do. The second and penultimate stage in my history of Unitarian Universalism falls under the chapter of liberation. This was a time, mid-20th century, when the world was riddled by tragedy. The Second World War had dispelled pervasive optimism of coming out of the 20s and the 30s, and had generally created an existential crisis within the modern West. Science, which up until this point, you'll remember with the religious humanists, was the core of revelation, well, lo and behold, science can produce an atom bomb. Communism, that again, you saw all of these early Unitarians and Universalists instill their faith into this socialized order. Well, lo and behold, communism can result in authoritarianism. And Wall Street, of course, could cause Main Street to financially collapse. So there was a general feeling of disillusion that was pervasive and really called into question religious humanism's uncritical optimism. Something had to be done. I think I said something that disturbed the gods. There was a man by the name of James Luther Adams, who was a professor of Christian ethics at Harvard Divinity School, who developed a liberal theology that took this tragic situation seriously, and arguably, according to many accounts, is, if not the one of the most formidable theologians of the Unitarian Universalist, or at that time Unitarian tradition in the 20th century. For him, God became a living, transforming reality in human lives that would help humanity reconstruct society. Adams infamously described humans as creatures who are fated to be free. It is our fate to have freedom, and as a result, we must use that freedom wisely and make responsible decisions. He, though, went on to deny this immaculate conception of virtue that was in some ways the hallmark of early Unitarian thought, arguing that good things are brought about by hard work done by human beings. And yet, at the same time, we are not alone in doing this hard work. He said that there are resources available to us beyond ourselves. We participate in a creative force that sustains us, that transforms us, and with us society. That God works, and God was a term he used to describe this creative potential, that God works upon us and through us. And he was in many ways influenced, as were many Unitarian and Universalist theologians of this time, by liberation theology, which was a movement that emerged from the Latin American and African American experience to recast Jesus and the life of Jesus as someone who gave a privilege and really whose life was a demonstration of the importance of looking out for the poor and the oppressed. That the God of the Hebrew Bible and of the New Testament is a God who always takes the side of the marginalized and the voiceless. And so this was increasingly a force that influenced Unitarian and Universalist thought of that time. Here's where we are today, but we've been in this stage for some time. It's what I would term a chapter of identity. Identity as to what it means to be a Unitarian, a Universalist, and then in 1961, a Unitarian Universalist, and the ways in which our identities are important when we think about how we live our religious lives. I'll start out with the fellowship movement and say something very briefly about that. About mid-century, mid-20th century, Unitarians felt that there was a yearning for increased Unitarian thought and Unitarian worship, but they didn't have enough ministers and they weren't exactly sure that they could plant churches and establish churches. And so what they did is they developed a program for implementing lay-led centers of religious worship in cities where there were no Unitarian churches at the time. And this was a relatively successful movement. They targeted places like Davenport, Iowa, or Memphis, Tennessee, especially more in the central part of the United States and out in the West. And so a lot of our churches today are heirs to this fellowship movement. Of course, as you have probably noticed up until this point, there in some ways was a century of courtship, you might say, between Unitarians and Universalists. So I've mentioned the ways in which they differed, but of course there were also many ways in which they were very similar. Universalists largely had rejected the Trinity, and Unitarians had affirmed the importance of moral striving in this life that was a hallmark of the Universalist faith. Thomas Starr King once infamously said, somewhat jokingly, and I think there's a fair amount of validity to this statement, that Universalists think that God is too good to damn them forever, whereas Unitarians think that they are too good to have God damn them forever. And so in some ways these were two sides of the same coin. In 1954 then, Unitarian and Universalist youth groups joined together to form the Liberal Religious Youth, known as the LRY, and that was the beginning of the gradual merging and consolidation of the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America. It was formalized in the year 1961, an important date to remember because 1961 is in some ways our birthday as Unitarian Universalists today. Dana McLean Greeley, who was the former president of the American Unitarian Association, went on to be the first president of the Unitarian Universalist Association. And that right there tells you something about the controversy surrounding this consolidation. Why should it be that formerly the Unitarian president would also become the Unitarian Universalist president? And it was often charged in Universalist circles that it was not really merging but submerging, that the Universalists were submerged and overtaken and overrun by the Unitarians. And so there was a fair amount of hesitancy on both sides, really, and some churches refused to participate in this act of consolidation. But these days, there's certainly things have died down a fair amount, and I think there is great agreement that this consolidation was important, and certainly important at a time when both denominations were seeing their numbers dwindle rapidly. Civil rights is another area where Unitarian and Universalist ministers and layfolk have been very involved, and you'll remember going all the way back to the 19th century. There were many Unitarian Universalist ministers who responded to Martin Luther King Jr.'s call for religious leaders to come down and march with him in Selma. In fact, it was Reverend James Reeb, a Unitarian clergyman from Boston, who was the first white person killed in those riots. And as a result, he sparked national outrage. In response, President Lyndon Johnson laid the Federal Voting Rights Act before a special session of Congress the following Monday. So in some ways, he is seen as a martyr of civil rights, and he was a Unitarian Universalist. At the same time, there has been tremendous internal division about how best to respond to anti-oppression and specifically to relationships with African Americans in our denomination. Historically, there have been two dominant camps. One, an integrationist camp that believed that whites and blacks should work together on these issues. On the other hand, there was a separatist camp that believed that it was really the responsibility of black Unitarian Universalists to figure out what they needed and then let the other dominantly white Unitarian Universalists know what decision they had come to. And this sparked tremendous uproar during this era. And I think we're still feeling some of the repercussions of that today. Sexuality is another area where Unitarian Universalists have always been on the forefront. The UUA became the first large denomination to have a majority of female ministers. We also developed the About Your Sexuality, AYS, curriculum, the precursor to the Our Whole Lives curriculum that many of you probably know about, in the 1970s. And it reflected a spiritual commitment to seeing sexuality as a natural and a healthy part of our spiritual lives. And it, of course, was met with a fair amount of resistance, but now is really one of the key things that many non-Unitarian Universalists know about our denomination, for better or for worse. I think for better. Denominationally, the UUA also created the Welcoming Congregation program to help churches become more inclusive towards bisexual, gay, lesbian, and/or transgender people, and we have really been on the forefront of that movement with the United Church of Christ, really heading up the importance of equality for sexual orientation. Lastly, I should note religious pluralism is how I would define where we find ourselves today. There is an influx of hyphenated religious identities, Unitarian Universalist Buddhists and pagans, Unitarian Universalist secular humanists. The list goes on. And this, I think, is in some ways a testament to this ongoing scramble for a theological center. And in some ways, that is the great challenge, I think, that we are facing. We obviously have many issues that we need to be concerned about. Immigration is another issue that has become really front and center of Unitarian Universalist consciousness. But this question about, is there anything that holds us together theologically anymore, is one of the major question marks that is still out there. Is about. There are objective ways, we might say, of answering this question. I'm going to provide them. And then there are subjective ways, what I think. And I'm going to share that with you as well. So just to give a bit of context, it is often said, and probably true for many of you, that Unitarian Universalism is a chosen faith. What does that mean? Well, I think there are 4 things that I have listed here that we should keep in mind when we call ourselves a chosen faith. For one, choice implies freedom and responsibility. You can't have one without the other. William James, the pragmatist, whom I mentioned earlier, he is remembered to have said, well, first ask the question, is life worth living? And his response was, it depends on the liver. Well, so too we might say, is our faith worth having? Is our faith worth choosing? It depends on the faith that we have chosen and how we live it out. And so with that freedom to choose and to believe as we wish, so too there is a great responsibility that we have. Secondly, I think it's important to remember that we are a creedless faith. We don't have a specific set of doctrine that incoming individuals who want to become members have to ascribe to be part of our religious community, which is a true blessing, in my opinion. But that does not mean that we are a beliefless group of individuals. James Freeman Clarke, an early Unitarian minister, said, "The divine word is a fuller fountain than has been believed. No creed can exhaust its meaning. No metaphysics can measure its possibility." So it's interesting that according to this perspective, which is one that I think is particularly poignant, our creedlessness is not that we're trying, that we can't figure out, that we're trying to keep people out, but rather that we're saying a creed cannot contain all that we have found to be true. So it's not a negative statement, it's a positive statement. It's a statement that there is this abundant fountain of truth and religious goodness that we want to find and that we have found, and that can't possibly be contained in a couple set paragraphs or sentences. Thirdly, that we're covenantal, but we're not chaotic, or at least I hope we're not. A covenant is our form of being together. And of course, you'll remember that here at First Parish, we recently spent a long time trying to hammer out exactly what that covenant looks like. I describe covenant as the promises that we make to each other. How will we be together in community? And so it's a real binding force. It's the glue that keeps us together and avoids the devolvement into chaos. And lastly, I like to say that we are a chosen faith because we believe in religious humility over certainty. Simone Weil, the great Christian mystic, wrote, "We do not have to acquire humility. There is humility in us. Only we humiliate ourselves before false gods." And so it is important for us to hold this religious humility because it's a recognition that we are always open to learning more, growing more, that we have not necessarily found the only or even the best way, but we found something that's transforming our lives, and that's important. The 7 principles. You have likely heard of them. I remember sitting in the first Unitarian Universalist class I took at HDS with a whole crew of aspiring ministers and ministers-to-be. And one person in that class was a non-UU and asked, so what do you guys believe? And of course, the gut response was, well, the 7 principles. She said, oh, well, what are they? 2 people could recite them, going through all of them, which is perhaps a testament to why they are not as well known as we wish they were. If your ministers are having trouble remembering, you can imagine the lay folk. But there are 7. A little background, they are actually an excerpt from our bylaws. Very spiritually uplifting that. They are primarily administrative, but of course they have seeped into our religious culture. And also you should note that there were originally only 6 at the time of consolidation in 1961, and they were plagued with sexist language. And that's why in 1984, 1985, they were revised following a 7-year-long process, and they come under review every 15 years. Recently, we saw that at our General Assembly, that they're open for change and debate, and much debate there is. But these are the 7 principles. The inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relationship, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and then respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. And it's that last one, respect for the interdependent web of all existence, that was added later. We not only have 7 principles, we have 6 sources. This is in some ways the question of, well, how do we get these principles that we espouse? And the 6 sources, as you can read here: direct experience of transcending wonder, words and deeds of prophetic women and men, wisdom from the world's religions, Jewish and Christian teachings of loving God and neighbor, humanist teachings of reason and science, and spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions. And as you hear that, I hope, given the magnitude of history that has just been walloped, that you've just been walloped with, I hope that you will start to see where some of these come from. You'll notice that direct experience of transcending wonder, and you'll say, the transcendentalists, questions of revelation. You'll see words and deeds of prophetic women and men. This Jesus character was probably one, but there have been others, and we are open to others. Wisdom from the world's religion. That late 19th century conference on the world religions and the gradual opening up and looking abroad. Jewish and Christian teachings of loving God and neighbor. You'll think back to the early ancestors. Humanist teachings, early 20th century, we talked about that. And spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions, the more recent identity stuff. So all of this is tied into where we have been and how we've gotten to where we are. I always like to say when people ask me, you guys can believe anything, I think our 6 sources demonstrate very palpably that we do not believe that all things are true, but we believe that we can find truth in all things. And this is in some ways what we're listing here, some of the places that are especially ripe for finding truth. So now is the fun part, the 5 pillars of our faith. This is in no way authoritative, but I think it's rather compelling because I drafted it myself. So, let me back up for 1 second. One other thing. So what is this? I have basically isolated what I believe to be the 5 core aspects of what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist. These are heavily influenced by our history and how we've gotten to where we are. They are certainly taking into account the 7 principles and the 6 sources. But I read a study recently that said that humans have a hard time remembering anything greater than 6, a list greater than 6. And I thought, 7 principles. Maybe I need 5. So you got 5. Firstly, we value religious freedom. arriving at our beliefs individually, but taking responsibility for them communally. So this ultimately is a reflection of our insistence on tolerance, but also the recognition that we grow in our faith when we allow other people to grow in their faith as well. And again, that responsibility piece, which is key, that with freedom, so too comes responsibility. Secondly, we affirm human dignity, celebrating the human spirit and making religious use of all its faculties. So there are a couple ideas that I think are encased in this. Certainly that emphasis on human dignity as opposed to human depravity. This is in no uncertain way a rebuke to original sin and to the idea that we are ultimately depraved human beings. I would not go so far as to say, though, that we don't sin, and that I think is part of that responsibility piece as well. But it is a celebration of the human spirit. It is taking all of the best parts of that religious humanist movement that continue to inform us today, and it's also making religious use of all human faculties, not feeling like I have to bracket out my mind when I come to church, not feeling like when I come to church I'm only going to get mind and can't use some heart, and above all, not feeling like the mind and the heart are not put into good use out in the world. So our hands are equally as important. So as we are praising the human experience, so too we are making religious use of all the various parts of what it means to be a human. To say on this point, affirming human dignity, to my mind, and celebrating the human spirit means that we should approach the human capacity for goodness with an ultimate optimism and a proximate pessimism. So both of those, we can be truly optimistic about human potential, but we also must not bracket out, and this is a real learning of that tragic episode, mid-20th century. We must not also forget, as many of our Unitarian ancestors did, the very fallibility of human beings. Thirdly, we advocate social responsibility, putting our faith in the service of justice, compassion, and peace. Religion concerns this life, and it also concerns our improvement of it all, of it for all. So suffering under this perspective is not to be endured as a punishment, but rather something to be relieved through direct action. And as you can see, the impulse to reform is something that has historically always been part of our tradition. John Haynes Holmes, the co-founder of the NAACP and the ACLU, who was a Unitarian minister, said, "We are not isolated entities, but social creatures." And so this is also an expression of our interdependence and interconnection. Fourth, we practice institutional democracy, opening our doors to all and respecting the voice of each. We believe that broad difference is more honest and more sacred than enforced sameness. That doesn't mean embracing every possible opinion and elevating it to the status of authority, but it means ensuring that everyone who walks through our doors knows that they are welcome and that their voice will be heard. Maybe not acted upon, but certainly heard. This is also, I think, a testament to the democratic governance of our religious institutions, and in some ways helps us understand that the church must not instruct the state, but it may learn from it, and it may learn democratic governance. And our covenantal faith is in some ways a protection of this very sacred principle, that we are making promises to one another as to how we can live this out. Lastly, we pledge theological companionship, journeying with each other from one source to one destination. There are two meanings that I draw from this particular statement. We companion one another in our individual searches for truth and meaning, but we too are companioned by that one source and that one holy fate. There are many names that we give to this. Certainly God is one, but we all know that God is not God's name. But our Unitarian and Universalist heritage, in my opinion, at its best, teaches that there is one source of all humanity, and that ultimately we are all headed in the same direction together. And so we are not only companions to one another in our social life, but also in our cosmic life, you might say. So with that, religious freedom, human dignity, social responsibility, institutional democracy, and theological companionship, I open the floor to questions.